Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torak, and today we're joined by Sarah John, who teaches history courses for us here at El Paso Community College, and she's going to be telling us about some very interesting women that have played a role in the history of El Paso. Some of them are prominent, some of them are not quite as well known. Sarah, welcome to Along the Rio Grande. Maybe we could start out by talking a little bit about how you became interested in El Paso history.
Well, I'm from El Paso originally. I was born here and I was reared here. And I grew up listening to a lot of stories about my family. My family is varied. I have, on my mother's side, Mexican and Irish, and on my father's side, Syrian. So I grew up listening to a lot of stories about the family, or each family. And I didn't know my grandparents, really. They died before I was born. 3 of them died before I was born, and 1 of them died when I was 5. So I really didn't know my grandparents. So listening to stories about them was interesting to me, to learn about the family. And just growing up listening to all these stories made me very, very interested in not only our family, but the history of the city itself, so that by the time I got into college, I wanted to learn more. So that's how I got into history, basically.
And what areas of history did you concentrate on?
Border history, Mexican history, local history. And my thesis was concerning immigration, Syrian immigration to the El Paso area before World War II. Oh. So I did that. And I learned more about other immigration patterns and other peoples that came through the Mexican border to the United States and so on. They're starting this new history museum at UTEP, they hope, the Ellis Island of the Southwest, and so my thesis really fit right into that because I did a lot of work on a lot of the Syrians that did come through Mexico to come to the United States.
Great. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later.
Sure.
At some point, you focused a bit on women in El Paso, and this is kind of an underrepresented area,
Yes.
Often difficult to
Yes.
find out information about women in El Paso. How did this interest start?
Well, back in, I can't remember the exact year, I don't remember if it was the late 70s or early 80s, but it was around that time. Texas, the state of Texas was celebrating women. There was a large grant that was put forth to study Texas women's history specifically. And I think the entire project was called Texas Women: A Celebration in History. So not only were people from Austin, of course, doing research on those women, but then towns or cities throughout Texas were also given the idea, why don't you study your women and we will incorporate them into this project, and so on. So I was fortunate enough to be chosen as one of the women on a committee here in El Paso, which was headed by Rebecca Craver at UTEP. I'm sure you know Rebecca.
Sure.
And so there were several of us on this committee, and we all took certain women that we wanted to research and so on, or contributed to this project. And we had our own celebration in El Paso history for women here at that time. And this is where a lot of the information that I'm going to be speaking about came from at that time.
Did you find it difficult to find
Actually, no. They were so, once we got out there, it was hard to find, maybe in some cases from the earlier ladies, the written materials.
Sure.
But there were certainly enough women that we wanted to showcase, and it was hard to choose how many women, because we only had a certain number of women that we could showcase. So we hated to cut out because there were so many. So for each woman we actually showcased in there, I'm sure there were hundreds more. And just like today, whoever I'm going to speak about, there are hundreds more that I could be speaking about too.
Now, I imagine it's difficult to find information about Native American women or people from the Spanish colonial period, but we know a little bit in general about women's lives in that era.
Yes, well, by the time the first Europeans, or before the time the first Europeans came here, we do know that the Manso Indian tribe lived in this area, the group, and they had been apparently coming through this area for a long, long time. They were the first, as far as I know, the first Native American groups that the Spaniards first encountered here in the El Paso area. Of course, we don't know any of the women's names of whatever, but of course they survived up until that time, and later on they were incorporated into and intermarried, I believe, with other Indian groups and perhaps Spanish as well.
Sure.
But they were the first of the Native Americans right here in our southwestern area that were encountered and been here a long, long time.
And with the coming of the Spanish, the Oñate expedition,
Right.
do we know much about those women?
I don't know. There were women with it, we know that. I don't know the names again, however, I do know that Juan de Oñate's wife was, and see if I get this right, I believe it's the granddaughter of Cortés and the great-granddaughter of Moctezuma, or vice versa.
Wow.
So she was a royal person. He married into royalty from the Aztec side, and so already we have the idea of the mestizo or mestiza coming through this area before 1600. Didn't stay here, obviously. Not until later do we have, for example, a mission in what's now Ciudad Juarez being established. But, in the first group of Spaniards coming through, you have Spanish women with their husbands, Mexican-born Spanish women, and then you have the mestiza coming through here, too. So already you have a mixture of cultures coming here at that time, before 1600.
Now, when we get into the 19th century, we know a little bit more. We have more information available.
A little bit more.
Let's talk about some of the Mexican and the Anglo-American women in the early part of the century and what their role was.
The first three women that I'm going to tell you about today are important because they married some of the first pioneer Americans that came into, at that time it was still Mexico. And actually, the reason, I may be prejudiced, but the reason I think that these men became prominent was the fact that they married into these families.
Sure.
It was a big help to them. They were able to get established. Perhaps they wouldn't have done as well had they not married into these families of northern Mexico. So maybe I'm prejudiced, but we may not have heard about these guys unless they had married into these families. But the first lady I want to mention is Juana Maria Azcárate. Azcárate is a very, very well-known name in the El Paso area. Miss Azcárate, or later she'll be Mrs. Stevenson. Her family was very well-to-do in northern Mexico. They had land on both sides of the Rio Grande. Remember, at that time, the Rio Grande is not an international boundary. So it's not uncommon for families who have land holdings to have land holdings on both sides of the river. And so when Hugh Stevenson hits this area in the 1830s and so on, of course, he becomes acquainted with the Azcárate family and eventually marries the daughter, Juana. They established their homestead, their little ranch, their whatever, on land that was Azcárate land on the north side of the river. They called their little homestead Concordia. It was established on what is today the Concordia Cemetery, named because that's exactly where the land was. And for those of you who are not familiar with Concordia Cemetery, it's in the area where we call the Spaghetti Bowl, or the interchange between I-10 and US 54. You can see the cemetery from that area. But that's where they had their homestead. And, again, if it wasn't, I think, for Juana Maria, I don't think Mr. Stevenson would have such a large land holding and so on. He became well known as a trader, a miner, et cetera. And I think it was because of the help,
the connections
that he had with her.
And this is a pattern that starts to develop?
This pattern, I mean, you can go into New Mexico with Kit Carson, and his wife, and all through the Southwest, New Mexico, of course, certainly here, West Texas, which was traditionally considered part of New Mexico until the 1850s, but that's a pattern that you can see all around this area. So she's the first that I wanted to mention in that vein. We also had Maria Gertrudez Valdez de Veramendi from a wealthy family also in Chihuahua. And she eventually became Mrs. McGoffin, okay? So when James Wiley McGoffin first wants to be a trader and so forth, here in this area, and he comes through what was in the Santa Fe Trail, and then he comes down from Santa Fe and to Paso del Norte and then to Chihuahua City, he's obviously trying to make his name and so on. He becomes involved a little bit in the politics of Chihuahua. He is well known there, and so he marries into this family. And again, I think this helped him tremendously in his endeavors, his political and economic endeavors as well. Mrs. McGoffin was very well known by the 1840s when the United States does take over this territory after the Mexican War, because several U.S. Army officers, when they established the first Fort Bliss, brought their wives with them. And really, there's no town of El Paso, as we all know. There were a few ranches in the Concordia, and then, a small place that they called McGoffinsville, which was their little homestead, and Franklin, and so on. So there wasn't really a town. The big town was Paso del Norte, which is now Ciudad Juarez.
Right.
But when these Army officers brought their wives with them. One of them, and I'm sorry her name escapes me at this moment, this American woman who came with her husband kept a diary of their stay here at Old Fort Bliss. Oh, yeah. And so she mentions, you know, of course, all that they had to go through. But one of the things she mentions was Mrs. McGoffin being so beautiful, Mrs. McGoffin being so hospitable to these women that she really didn't know and had no business, you know, having to get involved with. But there she was helping them, taking them, for example, to Paso del Norte to go shopping for their vegetables and so on, because there's no place here to go, and having military balls and so on, or teas or gatherings or parties at her home for these Army officers and their wives. Sure. So she, you know, really had the, she was the social person for the area at that time. So she was well remembered. And again, another one of those women that helped her husband considerably. So,
any others that we want to
Another one I'd like to mention is Juana Marquez. Juana Marquez was the daughter and granddaughter of Tigua Indian caciques, of the tribal leaders, chiefs. And she ended up marrying a man many years her senior, Ben Dowell, about 20 years her senior as far as I can remember. And eventually they moved into what's now downtown El Paso and so on. They had their little homestead there. At the time of the Civil War, Ben, as most of El Pasoans were at that time, were Southern sympathizers, Confederate sympathizers. And had to be, he was exiled, and they went to live in Paso del Norte for a while. Then he went off to do whatever he was going to do in the Civil War and be a Confederate hero or what have you. So here she is, coming from a powerful family as well, because she had some, you know, obviously if you're the granddaughter and daughter of caciques, I mean, you're somebody. And here she is having to live in exile and in another country, and having, you know, her children, and having to then sell off a lot of her goods to basically stay alive there until her husband came back. So once the war was over, of course, they did come back, and you know, with her children, everything moved back over here to this side, and eventually Ben Dowell becomes the first El Paso mayor. Oh. So she does become the first lady of El Paso, you know. But again, I think it was helpful to him to be married to a woman who had ties, political ties to the tribe at that time. I think it was to his advantage.
Now, once the Rio Grande becomes the international boundary, we have Anglo-American women coming in.
Sure, and you have several people that make contributions, you know, to this area. One I do want to talk about in particular, and she's a little bit later than the Mexican War, but still in the 1880s, 1890s, what have you. This is Mary Stanton, and Mary Stanton was a local teacher. And, you know, in those days, teachers, really up until the 20th century, you know, well into the 20th century, teachers did not get married. You know, teachers, when you were a teacher, you were taking care of your class as you would your children, but it was sort of, you know, you weren't expected really to be married and also teach.
They were your family.
They were your family, exactly. And Mary Stanton, then obviously a woman who was very worried and you know, careful about what her students were doing. Well, at that time, we did not have a public library in El Paso. I mean, we're still basically a frontier town. Remember, we didn't get the railroad until 1881, so, you know, we're still kind of a dusty town in the 90s and so on, late 1880s, early 1890s. But she decided to start a library using her own books. And what she did was she established what she called a reading club for young men. And I think that's interesting that she established for young men, but mostly her students. And so she used her own books for this, and she was able to get someone to open up an office somewhere in downtown El Paso where they had placed these books. After a while, more people became interested in that, obviously not just these young men or boys who were using it. So City Hall opened up a room somewhere to house them so that more of the public could use her books. And then I believe it was in 1895 or so, we were able to get a grant through Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a great philanthropist who gave money specifically for a library. I mean, that was one of his big things. So the city got money from Andrew Carnegie's foundation or what have you to open up a public library, and so then her books were, again, the foundation for the El Paso Public Library. So she was instrumental in building our library.
That's a great contribution.
Oh, extremely great. What's interesting about her is that she was very proud of having been independent all her life and not having been married. And she said that the life of, and I'm not going to quote her exactly, but she said that the life of a spinster was just, wonderful, and she enjoyed it very much. And she said that the ability to be able to say the word damn whenever she wanted to or in the right place was very rewarding for her. So she was a very, very independent woman at a time when really, we didn't think of women in that vein. So.
Now, the late 1800s and early 20th century bring a lot of different immigrant populations into our area.
That's right.
And with that, we have some interesting women.
Oh, very interesting. We have Olga Bernstein-Kohlberg. Olga Kohlberg came to not only the United States, but El Paso just almost immediately after the first railroad was built here. She was the wife of a tobacco merchant originally from Prussia. She was very, very well educated. She was in the society over there. I mean, she was from a well-to-do family, etc. So she hits, this little dusty town, and immediately it says, we're gonna make a city out of this town, and she goes to work in a lot of civic activities. She became involved, for example, in the development of the first women's club. She became also involved in the first library, the library. She helped formulate the first Temple Mount, the original Temple Mount Sinai for the Jewish congregation here. She also helped establish what they call the baby san, a baby sanatorium for babies in Cloudcroft, because as you know, our summers are so hot here that there was a lot of sickness, illness, or so, And so it was felt at that time that if you could move these babies out of town for a little while into the cool air and so on, that it would help their health. It was sort of a resort, or not a resort, but I mean a health area, healthful area for these kids. A retreat, thank you, for these babies. So she was instrumental in setting that up, and they did that for several years. But she's best known for establishing a kindergarten here in El Paso, and the reason this is important is because it's not only the first kindergarten in El Paso, but it's the first one in the entire state of Texas, and I'm sure probably in the entire Southwest. Coming from Prussia, she was used to having this kind of schooling for young children over there. Didn't have it here. She wanted to make sure her children, of course, had the best that education could offer. So she was very, very instrumental in, she is the person that started this idea of the kindergarten and started it here in El Paso. So she's very, very well known for that. And we just have recently, I don't know how many years now, but we've had a school named for her on the west side of El Paso.
And what other immigrant women come to
Also, Eugenia Schuster came with her husband to El Paso, I believe, in the middle 1890s, if I have my dates correct. She was originally from Hungary, also from a well-to-do family. Her husband was a physician and surgeon here, came here as a physician and surgeon, wasn't from here originally. Very well educated. She studied piano under Franz Liszt. I mean, this is, not just some lady off the street. I mean, she really came from a very prominent family back in Hungary. Again, coming to El Paso with her husband, they realized that there needs to be a good hospital here. So she actually is with her husband when they start talking about establishing a hospital, and they established the first Providence Hospital with other physicians as well. She, in fact, becomes the administrator for the hospital in those early years. So she's doing bookkeeping, and she's doing scheduling, and she's doing all of those kinds of things that a hospital administrator would do. But not only that, she is not above going beyond that. She does laundry for the hospital. She will clean up after a surgery. She will do janitorial work if it needs to be done. This is a woman that does not feel this is beneath her.
Sure.
She's dedicated. She's very dedicated to this. Going. Yes, and does everything that she can to make it work. So I always want to talk about Mrs. Schuster. We have to remember her as well.
Other immigrant women?
Let's see. I want to talk about Erlinda Wong Chu. Erlinda Wong Chu was originally from Mexico. Of course, she has a Chinese name, so That hints that her dad was Chinese, her mother was Aztec and Mexican, from Guadalajara. Marries another Chinese immigrant in Mexico at that time. They moved to Ciudad Juarez, okay, in the early 1900s, right at the time when the revolution is going on, etc. They have a small store that they opened up there. And, you know, Juarez during the Mexican Revolution was one of the big cities that both the revolutionaries and the Federalists wanted to control during the revolution. So they were always being shot up and so on. So it's not a good place to have a business or a family. I mean, she has a family at the same time. And wants to come to the United States. However, we are under the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we do not want Chinese in the United States at that time. Well, she makes it her business to find a loophole in the law. She has no background in law, of course. She is a businesswoman. She did have that background, but she had no background in law. But she had some contacts in El Paso. She went directly to, I guess, the head of immigration here at the border at that time, asked if she could look at the law books. And she did, and she read them, and she found some kind of a loophole which allowed her to, and her family, to come over to live in El Paso. So she was known as sort of this, you know, unofficial immigration person, you know, for other Chinese and for Mexicans too who wanted to immigrate because she knew the law so well.
Sure.
And as a matter of fact, people, I got this from her family, people who worked for the immigration at that time, I used to contact her and say, what do you know about this particular law or something? You know, I mean, she would advise them as well. So she was instrumental in doing that. Of course, they had a business here in El Paso. At the same time, the New China Grocery. And she reared not only her own children, but she and her husband took in orphans, et cetera, other Chinese orphans. And as far as we can tell, almost every single one of them were professionals. Her son became an immigration lawyer. And her daughters, you know, were either prominent in education, the education field, et cetera, later on in California. But, so here's a woman that was not afraid, excuse me, to, you know, when they said you can't do this, well, she was going to find a way to do it, and she did. She was also, during the Depression era, she was the only woman that I know of in El Paso, and perhaps, you know, one of very few in the state of Texas, who was on a federal NIRA board for business, et cetera. So she made her contribution to our city as well.
So we have a number of interesting women here by the early 20th century.
Definitely so.
Involved in business and developing some retail outlets.
Oh, yes. There are some women whose contributions were not as readily seen as hers. I mean, when you went into her store, you might have seen her or known her, or the greater community might have known her. But there are others maybe who were not. For example, there's a lady, Zakia Jabali Ayub. She came at the age of 13 to El Paso with her husband from Lebanon. At that time, it was known as Syria. It was part of Syria that later became Lebanon. Pardon me. And her husband had been here for a while, went back to the old country, married, and brought her here. She was very young, 13 or 14 years old, I believe, when she first came here as his bride. And he was a merchant. He had a small store, but he would also sell door to door. And so she comes to a place where she doesn't know the language, and they're right smack in the middle of the El Paso business district, which at that time was South El Paso Street, that area. So you had a lot of different kinds of people coming in to shop. You had people from the United States, Anglo-Americans, you had Mexican-Americans shopping there, you had people from Mexico crossing the bridge to shop there. So not only does she come to a country where she doesn't know the English language, she also doesn't know Spanish. Well, of course, she's going to learn it. So she learns English and Spanish to help in the business. While he's away, she has to take care of the store or whatever, so she has to learn at least about the money and so on, which she does. And she also would crochet things for him to sell or embroider things for him to sell. And so on. Well, he builds his business up to what was very well known by the 40s, excuse me, before the 40s, but the 30s, and as this merchant and trader and so on. And then the Depression hits, and so they lose everything. Oh. Well, she doesn't want to, just let everything go. So she, with a couple of her sons, begins selling candy out of a truck on a corner downtown, and candy and gum and things like that. And from that little, sidewalk business, she builds up a company that becomes well known here by the 40s and 50s and 60s, known as Border Tobacco Company. Border Tobacco by that time, sold everything you can imagine. It was well known as a candy store, a wholesale candy store and so on, but they would also sell retail, etc. But then it sold electronics, it sold luggage, it sold, you name it, they had it practically, jewelry and so on. So she actually built that. That was her business, and then her sons later, got into it with her and so on, and had it by the 70s and so forth. But that was her store, and she would, I interviewed her, and I found her at the store. I mean, that's where she was, and she was already in her 70s when I interviewed her. And I kept thinking, well, why is she working? I mean, this is a multi-million-dollar business. Why is she here? Well, she didn't have to work, but that was her store. I mean, sure. Why should she not be at her store? And she worked at her store. Almost till the day she died. I mean, she was there all the time, and that's where she wanted to be. That was her store.
Well, we certainly have some fascinating stories of women in the El Paso area. Have you been doing further studying on this, further research?
I've done a little bit more research. What I would like to do eventually is put together some kind of a book, a publication about these women and all of the others that we haven't been able to mention here today. When you go looking for El Paso women in books, you really don't find too many. What you find mostly are stories of the early madams and so on, which are a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to read those. It's part of our history. Heaven knows that our brothels paid for a lot of the early city paving on the streets and all those kinds of things, But that's not all El Paso history. I mean, that's not all of El Paso history concerning women. So
we've had a lot of women that are kind of behind the scenes, but are making a very important contribution to the development of the city.
You bet. So I think I've done a little bit on my own, as I had told you a little earlier, that I've done some publications with our password here, the Historical Society's publication and so on. But I would like to see a book and maybe get the women, some of the women who worked on this Texas Celebration in History project that we did many years ago, put that together, get their research and so on, and maybe put something together. So I'm hoping for that.
Well, Sarah John, we certainly want to thank you for coming in today and sharing some of this fascinating information with us.
I appreciate it.
Hopefully we can add to this and
anytime you call me back.
Talk about some women in the 20th century as well. Thank you for coming on the program and telling us about El Paso women.
Thank you very much. See you, George.
And thank all of you for joining us as well today here on Along the Rio Grande. And we hope to see you on our next program.